So you've spent decades on agricultural ecology, livestock, forages, soil microbes, and how they all work together. If a friend who'd never really thought about farming that way asked you to explain what you do in one or two sentences, how would you do it?
I I farm with nature.
That
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 was
would
one
be
sentence. One sentence.
yeah. Yeah.
I believe that the fundamental principles of ecology can be applied rather than just read by students and regurgitated on exams. And I believe that the Earth is has been for 4.5 billion years a food system. Everything is eating. Plants eat, animals eat, microbes eat. And if we just tap into the knowledge that is embedded in planet Earth, we arrive at a point where food production is feasible without damaging the planet. One of the great you know what a non sequitur is? A
I've heard the
statement
term.
that doesn't logically follow the previous statement. We depend on the earth to produce food, but to produce food, we have to destroy the earth. Okay, that's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, for the last 2,000, 10,000 years, and especially in the last 70 years, we've been doing just that. And so I believe that and I'm not alone, there are many farmers. Increasingly, there are more and more farmers who believe that, not only believe, but actually prove that the earth is a system that wants to provide us food that we don't have, and we don't have to damage the planet to do it. So that's more than two sentences.
Yeah.
But the first sentence, I farm with nature,
Yeah, that's
is
the extended edition of that question. Yeah. So you were trained on as a marine biologist and you spent years on plankton and other types of ecology before you really pivoted to agricultural ecology in the early 2000s. Was there a specific moment or paper or experience or anything of that sort that really pulled you into food and farming? And is that type of pull still there?
yes, and it wasn't really a moment, it was a memory. So I was actually, as an undergraduate in college, my parents wanted me to go to medical school and become a doctor. Okay. And I used to travel between my home in Rockland County and the university, the college that I was attending. And I would see these beautiful landscapes with cattle in them. And that always stuck in my mind. And years later, decades later, I was the principal investigator and chief scientist in a very large project. I was headquartered at the University of South Carolina. It was called the Land Use Coastal Ecosystem Study. And we were studying how suburban sprawl was affecting coastal estuaries. And I began thinking about landscapes at that point because sprawl takes place on landscapes. And when we moved back to New York from South Carolina, my interest in landscapes was ignited by the agricultural landscapes that I saw. And I think my wife and I decided, okay, we're going to get a few sheep and see if we don't kill them over the winter. And we didn't. They survived, we survived, and the rest is history. We just really enjoyed it. And so that was really what got me into agriculture. And as a scientist, you can't have a bunch of sheep and not do an experiment. So I started studying sheep and actually how sheep could be used to manage invasive plants. And as I read and learned more about agricultural ecology, I saw this big gap in the soil where the microbes live. And so I started looking at microbes and how they connect and with cycle of life above the soil. And within the soil. And that's how I guess it all came together.
Yeah, so when most people picture a farm, they picture rows of crops or fenced-in animals, not really an ecosystem. What's something about soil or grazing animals or how a working farm actually functions that would really surprise the average person?
I think one thing that people and I've had hundreds of students up at our farm. We every year I teach a class, not a course, but a couple of classes on applied ecology, and I use agriculture as an example of applied ecology. But at the end of the day, if you talk to a farmer, and this may or may not be what you're expecting to hear, but the thing that a farmer is doing is putting food on his table and a roof over his family's head and shoes on his children's feet. Farming is not it's not a frolic, it's not an academic exercise. For many, it's a life and death process. These days, just loaded with stress because of how hard it is to make that living. But it also is just so beautiful and so exciting. I kid with people that if I didn't have my sheep and my dog and get up every morning to move my sheep with my dog, I don't really know what the point of getting up in the morning is. And so it's both love and fear. That's what a farm is. And it's also, I know, especially we're having a lot of problems with the dairy industry in New York right now. And dairy farmers are just stressed out. But they can't give up dairy because they are their farm. Does that make sense to you? Does that
Mhm.
do you
They
understand?
are, yeah, they are
They
the
are their farm. In fact, we're getting ready to put up a what's called a barn quilt, which is a wooden panel with the design on it. And our barn quilt will say in colors, farm is home, is farm is home. And that's how farming is. It's inseparable. For we you become inseparable from the land. And I quite honestly, I've published 100 papers and reports and things, but the most important work I've ever done is the 20 years I've spent on this farm, both the science and just the farming, the production of food for other people.
Yeah, so you make a big case on how grazing animals, when managed well, they can actually sequester carbon and rebuild soils rather than degrade them. Can you
Mhm.
explain what that finding really means and why it matters?
Well, and it's being reproduced. That finding is being reproduced multiple times. Sequestration, especially with well-managed farms, especially in the finishing stage. If you're raising beef cattle, all beef cattle start out on grass. They're all grass-fed. It's the finishing process where that layer, the finishing means the layer of fat a layer of fat is being generated around the carcass, around the meat. And that finishing process often takes place in a feedlot. If you if you compare the sequestration of carbon in in a pasture soil or even a rangeland soil and compare it to the sequestration of carbon in a feedlot, there's just no comparison. In fact, a 30-year study by, I don't know his first name, but his last name is Dietz and his colleagues, recently showed that grazing in well-managed pasture sequesters more carbon than any kind of crops, maize or soybeans or anything. Carbon by carbon sequestration by grazing is an amazingly effective process. We know that just the cycling of nutrients from from the soil, from the plants into the soil and back into the animals, then back into the soil, goes 21% faster when it's grazed than when it's not grazed. In other words, what's happening is the animals are producing urine and feces that has already been processed by microbes in the rumen. So the feces has been pre-formulated for the microbes in the soil, which are the same microbes in many cases as the microbes in the rumen. So the ruminal microbes, the soil microbes are similar. And now the microbes in the rumen have prepared, they've processed the feces for the microbes in the soil to process. And that creates a much more efficient cycle than just if the grass was just to decompose by itself as it gets old and dies.
Yeah, so right now there's a real fight in the climate world whether livestock are really the villains or part of the solution, and a lot of people only hear the methane number. What gets lost when the whole conversation collapses into just cows are bad? And I've heard a lot of different perspectives on something
Mhm.
like this.
First of all, I'm pretty familiar with that argument. First of all, the first argument is that cows take up a lot of land. That could be used as what? Walmart distribution centers? I think grazing is a pretty good use of the land. Producing food, what's wrong with that? And and grazers will be on land. I cannot grow crops on my soil. It's full of clay, it's full of rocks, it's hilly. It will not grow food as crops, but it grows food as sheep. It's growing food as we speak as sheep because the sheep are harvesting the grass and we can harvest that meat. And that's the first part of the argument. I'll go to the second part of the argument too, which is it's not fair to kill lambs or cattle because it's so awful. If you eat something, something dies, whether it's the children of tomatoes or the children of sheep or a cow. When we eat something, something dies. Okay. So we didn't make the rules. That's just the way ecology has worked for the past 4.5 billion years. And that's the way it is. So the best way to prevent hurting anything is don't eat. And then you won't hurt anything. Nothing will die. Okay. Except you. Okay, so that's the second part. I can tell you I've watched two of my sheep, my lambs, being processed, being killed. It is the most humane process you could imagine. It takes seconds. Compare that to a lion in the Serengeti taking down a wildebeest, which takes at least a half an hour of incredible pain, incredible stress on the animal. But nobody says that lion isn't entitled to that meat. Okay. Or a monkey or chimpanzees, which hunt for monkeys. They tear the monkey in half physically, and they also eat vegetables just like us. Ethical issues, if you raise animals, and one of the reasons we raise animals is because we set the ethics. And I believe something that Wendell Berry, have you heard of Wendell Berry? Wendell Berry is a really great author and farmer. And he said, I hate to think an animal has suffered to feed me. And so for the time that our animals are alive, they are living a very good life. We ensure that for them. Right now, I have a bunch of ewes on pasture with their lambs. Their lambs will not be separated from them until the boys, the rams, are 4 months old, at which point they're old enough to breed with their siblings and mothers. And so we have to remove them. But that is the exact same process that bison have evolved to do in Yellowstone. They form bachelor herds so they don't interact with their parents and sisters. Okay, so we follow those rules of nature and we follow rules of ethics. We play classical music in the barn because it's been found to lower the tension in the barn, not just by us, but by the University of Leicester in England actually did a study where they found dairy cattle produce 3% more milk when listening to classical music as opposed to cattle not listening to music. Okay, that's the ethics. Now the carbon issue. Did Fred tell you about the paper that we published?
No, I was actually just going to ask about that.
Okay, we looked at 38 years of methane data from cattle over the entire globe. Okay. It's beef cattle, dairy cattle, everything. Okay. And what we found is that the rate of change is very close to zero. In other words, it's a high number, but it's constant. Okay. Why is it constant? It's actually, I think, now going to be falling because we're seeing a decrease in the number of beef cattle on the planet. But the number is fairly constant. If you compare that to the methane being produced by oil and gas production, we see that the methane from oil and gas production is increasing at a rate 4 times faster than the rate of methane from cattle. So why is that? The reason is something called the biogenic carbon cycle. Methane is a fairly short-lived form of carbon in the atmosphere. It varies, but 10 to 12 years is the length of the half-life of methane in the atmosphere. So the methane is turning into carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is being used by plants for photosynthesis. The plants exude some of that carbon dioxide into the soil, and some of it is eaten by herbivores, which put methane into the atmosphere, which turns into carbon dioxide, which is used by plants, which is eaten by animals, which is turned into methane. You see the cycle? And that cycle means that there's no new methane, no new carbon being put into the atmosphere. Whereas things like oil and gas production are taking carbon that's been buried for 65 million years and putting it into the atmosphere. So that's new methane into the atmosphere. About 33 million metric tons a year of methane is absorbed right on the pasture, right in the soil by a group of bacteria called methanotrophic bacteria or methanotrophs. They use methane as an energy source, like we use carbon, like plants use carbon dioxide. That's not quite an energy source, but they use methane as food. And a healthy pasture is sequestering methane as well as carbon dioxide by photosynthesis. And ultimately, you know that some of the carbon that's turned into photosynthate is mostly sugar. Okay, that drives the plant. And some of that photosynthate is transferred through the roots into the soil and used by microbes. In fact, we know there's a whole economy. There's a group of fungi called the Arbuscula mycorrhizae, which actually attach to the root. And fungi, actually heterotrophs. They are eating material like feces, like dead animals and plants. They are taking the nutrients that they get, and some of that nutrient is waste. It's nitrogen and phosphorus, which the plant needs. So the plant trades with the fungi. They sugar, which is the first product of photosynthesis. It's a 3-carbon sugar. And in return, they get phosphorus. We know this now. This is new, but this is now known science. As that happens, the bacteria and fungi live good lives and actually become incorporated into a small ecosystem that both the plant and the microbe do better. The plant, for instance, if there's a pest that is eating the plant, if that pest becomes too severe, The plant will signal to the bacteria saying, I'm in trouble. And the bacteria will make a chemical that drives off the predator, the herbivore.
Yeah.
And so there's your
Yeah.
ecology, and it works really well.
Yeah, a few more questions for you.
Sure.
So on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being most urgent, how should the average be about the state of our food and farming system, and why that particular number?
Question to ask a farmer because, of course, it would be a 10. Most the chances that Americans will go hungry are more of a political issue than an agricultural one. The chance that it could fail as a function of changing climate, and also in this kind of has never been really to the fore. But as much as climate is a crisis, we have a crisis in soil that is, by some estimates, half the soils on the planet have been degraded of our food is either produced on or in the soil. Won't run out of food because we'll get it from someplace else, as we're doing now. Farming is a system to crisis.
You would say.
I
And
would say maybe more. Raising soybeans last year, and this is before the tariffs, we're losing $83 per acre. People producing other crops, and I can't remember which ones they were, but as much as you were losing as much as $250 an acre. Okay. If you are a dairy farmer, it costs you nominally, very least, $30 to produce 100 pounds of milk. We call that a hundredweight. That's how milk is sold by the hundredweight. It costs about $30 for you to produce a hundredweight. You're getting between $17 and $18 per hundredweight. That's USDA. No, those are USDA numbers. Okay. Completed a report on dairy farming in New York, and between 2014 and 20, every year, 222 dairy farms. Okay. But the number of cattle were staying the same. So what's happening is the industry is being concentrated
yeah.
and bought by huge conglomerates of mine who founded a creamery out from under his feet by a company called Horizon, where Horizon, okay, so this is a New York dairy and Colorado to meet the CEO of the person who now owns that dairy. Okay. And he showed him the paperwork that 800 farmers are producing milk below cost. And the CEO of this company did not know that. He was completely surprised. Also, that his company was losing money. But so I would say that the condition of farming is terrible. And the condition of the food system is also terrible because I tell students this, nobody's undernourished, but I would bet for every 100 people, at least 50 and probably closer to 75 are malnourished, nourish,
Yeah.
eating things that are just not good for you, is completely unaware of the process that when it comes to, for instance, protein. It's not just whether we should be eating meat protein or plant protein. It's how well a given protein meets our needs in our
Yeah.
diet. So let's just say that there's a scale, and there is from 0 to 100. Okay. Beef is 92. Believe it or not, chicken is 92 or 52%. Beans are meeting 52% of your protein needs, and beef is meeting 92 to actually 95, depending upon the cut of your protein needs. Okay, that's the real difference between foods, and that doesn't get into the public very often.
Yeah. So, keeping with that, I don't have too many more. I think I have one or
Okay.
two left. But one is what is one simple, specific thing that a regular person who's not a farmer or a policymaker could do that would shift the food system in a better direction?
Know your farmer for a person.
Yeah.
So many farmers markets now. Anybody can go and interact with half a dozen farmers, and you'll find one that you like, and they'll answer your questions and talk to you about how they produce their food and why the guy with the carrots from the guy with the dirty knees who is out harvesting carrots at 5:30 that morning, why his carrots are better than the carrots that have been sitting on a truck for a week and coming from California. Okay. The single most important thing is know your farmer.
Hmm.
And one of the things we're trying to do with this project is getting farmers to be more active within their communities. So be being able to explain that a lot of farmers really just want to be on the farm. They want to work with their cows or their sheep, and that's completely okay. But at the end of the day, the public needs to know what farming is all about.
Yeah.
And it's all about putting food on their table. Somebody once said to Henry Ford, "You're in the business to make cars." And Ford said, "No, I'm in the business to make money." And the same is true with farming. I'm not in the business to make food. I'm in the business to make money as a commercial farmer. But in doing that, the way I make my food and how I relate to the land, that is what differentiates a regenerative farmer from a farmer who is just in it to make money or is basically enslaved to a large corporation that is in it just to make money.
Yeah. So, who are a few scientists or thinkers who you think I should interview after you? They don't have to be in your specific sector of agriculture.
Somebody once said to me, he thinks the farmers are ahead of the science at this point. And so maybe I don't know if you can reach him because he's sick right now. He's going to die, but he's an icon in agriculture and he's really smart. And he's done many TED Talks, and his name is Gabe Brown. And
Mhm.
he has a farm. His son is actually a biology professor at a I'm not sure which college in North Dakota, but he is, I would say if you talk to Gabe Brown about agriculture, he would be a really good, he would give you, he would share his wisdom with you. And I think that you would be impressed.
Yeah.
Other scientists, I'm not sure where he is, but his name, it escapes me now. Chris. And I'm using his papers, but I can't think of his last name, so I'm sorry.
I can
Um,
send you an email, and
okay, yeah, do
that
that.
would probably
I'll
be
send
easier.
you a couple of
Yeah,
names.
of course. Yeah, so I got one more question. I really love asking this. I've gotten so many different, very insightful
Right.
answers from this last question, and it's if every teenager on Earth had to hear one final sentence from you, what would it be?
Understand your place in the natural world.
All right. Yeah, that's all the questions I have. This is definitely one of the more extensive interviews I've done. I really enjoyed this one.
Oh, great.
Very fascinated to hear more from the people that you think I should talk to next. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I will send you the interview once I've uploaded it and
Great,
whatnot.
great. And can I hear other scientists
Oh
as
yeah,
well?
of course.
Great,
There's a
great.
lot of different other scientists, some really great perspectives. Obviously, Fred's interview is up there. There's a professor named Susanna Hecht at UCLA
Okay.
who I did a really interesting interview with about
Have you
Amazon.
spoken to Jason Roundtree?
Pardon?
Jason Roundtree at Michigan State. It's
Yeah.
Rowntree.
Yeah. I'll definitely look at that.
Yeah, look him up. He's great.
Have a good night.
Great. Thank you very much.